And we can get started whenever you'd like, Chair Saylor.
Very good. And in a second, Director Desmond, I'd like to ask if you would lead us in a moment of silence for the loss in your district. But when we get to that moment, I'll let you know.
Sure, I appreciate that.
Okay. All right. I'd like to call this meeting to order. And let's see, Vice Chair Bradford, would you like to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Sure. We stand, salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So this is the Transportation Committee of the Sacramento Area Council of Governments Board of Directors. This is our March 3rd, 2022 meeting. Lynette, would you call the roll, please?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. Director Branscombe? Absent. Gog?
Yes.
Guerrero? Or Ledesma for Guerrero? Absent. Jennings? Absent. Joyner?
Here.
Lozano? Absent. Sander? Absent. Chenier?
Here.
Branscombe is here.
Oh, I'll let the record show that he's here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Spokley? Absent. Soon?
Here.
Vice Chair Bradford?
Here.
Vice Chair Desmond?
Here.
Chair Saylor?
Here.
Do we have ex officio member Fong for Benny Paul?
Here.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I can see Spokley on screen.
Thank you. I'll note that he's here also.
Lozano has just joined us as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. Vice Chair Desmond, would you like to lead us in a moment of silence or other recognition of the events in your district?
Yes, thank you, Chair Saylor. I appreciate this opportunity. As you all know, we had a tragic, horrific shooting in the Arden Arcade area on Monday evening. And I'd like to ask you to join me for just a brief moment of silence to recognize the victims of that terrible tragedy and the impact it's had on so many people, their families, and members of the community. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Chair Saylor. That means a lot.
Thank you. We're with you. We know how challenging these circumstances can be. So thank you for your leadership. So we're now at that point in our meeting where we open to public communications. This would be an opportunity for any member of the public to address this committee on matters that are not on our agenda or matters that are on the consent calendar, because in a minute we'll take those up and act on those items as in a single vote. So is there anybody who is ready to address who wants to address the board or this committee in public comment?
Chair Saylor, I don't have any public comment through email, and I don't see any raised hands from our public attendees.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Then that leads us to the consent calendar, which is items 1 through 7. Christina, do you have anything to remove from the consent calendar? No, it's all good from your perspective. Any member of the board of the committee have anything to remove? I note that Chris Ledesma has joined us for Guerrero.
Chair, this is Chris Branscombe. I'd like to make a comment on business not on the agenda. It'll be very brief.
Can we do that after the consent calendar?
Of course. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll do that in just a second then. So let's, is there a motion to approve the consent calendar?
Move to approve the consent.
Okay, so we have a motion by Director Gog and a second by Vice Chair Bradford to approve the consent calendar items 1 through 7. Would you please call roll in that? Or
Thank
call
you.
vote?
Yes. Director Branscombe?
Aye.
Gog?
Yes.
Ledesma for Guerrero?
Yes.
Jennings? Absent. Joyner?
Aye.
Lozano? Director Lozano, could you indicate your vote? I'll come back to you in case you're having technical difficulties. Director Sander,
Aye.
thank you. Chenier,
Aye.
Spokely,
Yes.
Soon,
Aye.
Vice Chair Bradford,
Aye.
Vice Chair Desmond,
Aye.
Chair Saylor,
Aye.
and Director Lozano, if you're able, can you indicate your vote, please? Okay, I'll mark him absent. Thank you. Motion carries.
Thank you. And Director Branscombe, we do have an item on our agenda called Other Matters that comes at the end of our business items. Is that appropriate for you, or do you have something you'd like to address before that point?
It could keep, but I may have to leave early is my
Okay,
concern.
please let us know what's on your mind.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate that very much. Yesterday, Marysville we had a groundbreaking ceremony on the Fifth Street project that had been in the works for quite some time. I'm sure you're all aware of that. At the ceremony, I made a special point. Well, it was a necessary point to really thank SACOG, and I particularly pointed out former Mayor Ricky Semayoa's involvement in moving this whole project forward. A great deal of gratitude. It is a function and beautification project that's really going to help Marysville. And in a couplet to the ceremony with respect to the Fifth Street project, the eastern end of that project is at the terminus are two of the worst buildings in Marysville, the Marysville Hotel and the State Theater. Those of you who are familiar with Marysville will recognize the problem. Tuesday night at our council meeting, I started the ball rolling on a blight tax, akin to the same kind of tax that's you can see in Washington, D.C. and other cities across the country to inspire commercial development. So thank you very much, SACOG, for the Fifth Street project. And we're going to see what we can do to make the eastern terminus befitting of the improvement to Fifth Street. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Director Branscombe, for calling that out, calling it to our attention. We appreciate that. That brings us to item 8, our first item for action, which is the Barbara von Bechtold will lead us off, and this is funding of transit projects with section 5307 and 5339 funding.
Good morning, everyone. I'm
Good
Barbara
morning.
von Bechtold, as part of our transportation team at SACOG. So the FTA 5307 and 5339 discretionary share funding is available to eligible transit operators in the Sacramento urbanized area. Last year in September, the board approved an updated evaluation criteria for these discretionary share funds. That's attachment B as part of your staff report package for these funds, and also released for a call for projects for the discretionary share portion of the funds. The updated evaluation criteria brought our next generation transit strategies into the application evaluation process, as well as other updates. On December 13th of last year, SACOG issued the discretionary share program call for projects with applications that were due on January 21st of this year. SACOG received 6 eligible applications from our 4 transit agencies and SACOG. Attachment A provides a summary of the recommended project list containing just over $7.15 million in new programming covering federal fiscal years 2020 and 2021. So staff requests that the Transportation Committee recommend that the board program the discretionary share FTA section 5307 and 5339 funds for federal fiscal years 2020 and 2021 to the projects identified in attachment A. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about this item.
Thank you, Barbara. Are there questions from the committee members? I don't see any hands raised or otherwise seeking attention for comment. Are there any public comments on this topic?
I don't see any public comment.
Thank you. Is there a motion to move forward?
I'll move to approve.
Thank you, Director Gog.
Your
Second.
So we have a motion by Director Gog and a second by Director Chenier. Please call the roll.
Thank you, Director Branscombe,
Aye.
Gog,
Yes.
Ledesma for Guerrero,
Yes.
Jennings, absent Joyner,
Aye.
Lozano,
Aye.
Sander,
Aye.
Chenier,
Aye.
Spokely,
Yes.
Soon,
Aye.
Vice Chair Bradford,
Aye.
Vice Chair Desmond,
Aye.
and Chair Saylor.
Aye, thank you.
Thank you. Motion carries.
And that brings us to item 9, the SACOG Public Transit and Human Services Transportation Coordinated Plan update. Is this Barbara again? You're on mute, Barbara.
Sorry. All right. Yes, this is me again. So staff has completed an update to the SACOG Public Transit and Human Services Transportation Coordinated Plan. Going forward, I'll just call it the Coordinated Plan because the title is quite a mouthful. So the update to the SACOG Coordinated Plan, we made numerous changes to the plan, including updating all of the demographic information on our target populations for the plan, which is comprised of older adults, the disabled population, and those with lower incomes. We also updated the inventory of transit, specialized, and supplementary transportation services in the SACOG region, and we included changes to services related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we also added additional information on potential transportation mobility options for the target populations from recent SACOG plans, studies, and stakeholder outreach efforts. A coordinated plan or draft plan is required by Caltrans to accept applications, select projects, and distribute funding under the FTA Enhanced Mobility for Seniors and Individuals with Disabilities program. It's known as Section 5310. Selected projects and strategies must be included in a locally developed coordinated plan to be eligible. The completion of the plan, this plan update, extends the eligibility of transportation providers to seek funding through the FTA Section 5310 program. And just a quick note, all of you received a revised version of the plan yesterday. The revision corrected Table 1 on page 21 to include Yolo County. We had a formatting issue and had to update that so it showed Yolo County, showed all 6 of our counties in the document. All the other information remained the same, and the revised version of the draft coordinated plan was also posted on our plan page on the SACOG website as well. So staff asked that the Transportation Committee recommend that the board approve by resolution the updated SACOG coordinated plan and authorize its submission to the appropriate state and federal agencies. With that, I can answer any questions on the plan or our process.
Thank you, Barbara. Very clear. Are there any questions for staff? I don't see any hands. Are there any members of the public who would like to comment on this topic?
There's no public comment.
Very good. Are we ready for a motion then, colleagues? I think Mr. Spokley is nodding his head up and down. I take that to be a motion. Okay. So Mr. Branscombe has made the motion and Mr. Spokley has seconded it. Right, Matt?
Absolutely right.
All right. Then let's call a vote, please.
Thank you. Director Branscombe,
Aye.
Gog,
Yes.
Ledesma for Guerrero,
Yes.
Jennings, absent Joyner,
Yes.
Lozano,
Aye.
Sander,
Aye.
Chenier,
Aye.
Spokley,
Yes.
Soon,
Aye.
Vice Chair Bradford,
Aye.
Vice Chair Desmond,
Aye.
and Chair Saylor.
Aye.
Motion carries.
That
Chair
brings us-
Saylor, do you mind if I just, I think we have Director Chair Jennings in the waiting room. Just want to make sure that our staff knows he's waiting to get in.
We'll make sure to pull him in. Thank you, James.
Very good. That brings us to item 10 then, which is a resolution in support of a raise application. And this one I think is Christina. Yes.
Yes, it is. Are you all able to see my screen?
Looks like it's starting up. Yes.
Okay, super. Okay. So wanted to give everybody an update on what we're planning here at SACOG. We will be submitting an application for a RAISE grant in this current cycle here. So the RAISE program was formerly known as the BUILD grant, and it stands for Rebuilding American Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity. This program offers planning and capital infrastructure grants, and both of them have minimum awards of $5 million and a 20% local match is required. The RAISE grant program goals that have been identified are based off current key administration goals. So you can see here, there's a general trend to shift focus from the traditional way of approaching roadways and mobility and moving towards a more efficient system that addresses many of the concepts that we at SACOG are emphasizing through efforts like our blueprint, Green Means Go, and a number of others. So SACOG, as I mentioned, is planning to submit an application that designs a truly 6-county regional program that's focused on transportation infrastructure. The key concepts will be investments that help expand and increase low carbon and BMT investments and travel opportunities, and a program that promotes both innovation and equity. We anticipate having a program that truly is all encompassing, with infrastructure touching everything from bike and pedestrian facilities to clean truck facilities, given the importance of our region with freight and logistics. The program will recognize the different challenges that are faced by each of our counties and the communities that are within them, and aim to overcome those with viable solutions that promote carbon reduction strategies at all levels, and ultimately set up our communities for success. So the project itself is somewhat modeled after green zones, in that we plan to identify key zones where infrastructure investments should be focused to achieve our goals and those of the state. There's strong regional coordination at all levels that we're planning for this. So not only do we plan to work closely with our partner RTPAs in Placer and El Dorado County, but also our individual counties and jurisdictions, our transit providers, and at the community level as well, through participation with CBOs and other non-government organizations. There's something, I think it's important to say that there's something in this program for everyone, whether it's a rural car share program to increase mobility in hard to serve areas, or zero emission vehicle charging infrastructure for transit or freight vehicles, or even safety improvements that are necessary to make people more comfortable biking and walking. The proposed work would include identifying zones in the 6-county region and would prioritize projects within those zones, which we'll do at the county level. So each county would have their own set of priorities to work from. And given the size of the grants, which is a minimum, like I said, of $5 million, we'll also have what we're calling seed funding for high priority projects to move them through pre-construction activity, which will make them really well positioned for capital funding for further implementation. So we're starting our application now, and we're going to continue to refine the concept through that, as well as through continued engagement with our partners through the process. We are bringing on board someone to help us write the grant so that we have really just dedicated focus on this. It's really important for us, I think, in our region. So submittals are due April 14th, and awards are anticipated to be announced in fall of 2022. So with that information, I'd be happy to answer any questions, but there is a motion. So the recommendation is that the Transportation Committee adopt the resolution endorsing and authorizing SACOG to submit a RAISE grant application to the US DOT to fund a regional carbon reduction and multimodal transportation infrastructure investment program. So happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. And the resolution language, can you put that on the screen for folks to see it? Or do you have that available? Here it is, okay. All right, very good. Are there questions from the committee members? I don't see hands raised at this point. Thank you for that. Are there any questions, colleagues? Okay, very good. Are there any members of the public who'd like to address us on this point?
There's no public comment.
All right, is there a motion?
Joyner moves approval.
Second.
Okay, very good. So Director Joyner moves approval, and Director Gog has made a motion to second that, or has seconded that motion. Can we call roll?
Thank you. Director Branscombe?
Aye.
Gog?
Yes.
Ledesma for Guerrero?
Yes.
Jennings?
Yes.
Joyner?
Aye.
Lozano?
Aye.
Sander?
Aye.
Chenier,
Aye.
Spokely,
Yes.
Soon,
Aye.
Vice Chair Bradford,
Aye.
Vice Chair Desmond,
Aye.
and Chair Saylor.
And I'm
Thank you.
very excited about this. So thank you, Christina, for bringing this to us. And this could be a really strong way to actualize our 6 county regions goals and vision. So thank you for bringing it to us. And thanks, colleagues, for your support for this motion. Next item is item 11, which is the 2024 Blueprint Pathway Framework Outline. And Benu Abraham, are you going to be presenting this?
Morning. So I am Binu Abraham, the project manager for the 2024 update of Blueprint. Give me 1 second so that I can share my screen. Let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes.
Thank you. So this is an informational item to discuss the pathway framework. And before I go into the pathway framework as such, I just like to take a minute to see or recap and review what we have done so far in the Blueprint project and where we are and where we are going now. So last month, the board in February adopted the triple bottom line policy framework. The framework includes the triple bottom line goals, which are the triple E of equity, economy, and environment. This framework also includes a regional growth forecast, which will be used to forecast the 2035 and 2050 growth projections for the 2024 Blueprint update. Another component of that is we also have an updated engagement and outreach strategy to effectively do outreach and gather input regarding the plan. So these together constitute the policy framework, along with an outline that will have a set of high-level goals for an integrated multi-modal transportation system and regional development patterns that can create a more thriving region for our residents. So where are we in the process? This is our process map that we have shared with the committee before. And we are at a point where we just wrapped up our phase 1. I know it's a little bit complicated. So if you look at the bottom bar, you can see the years, and the top bars show the phase and the seasons. So right now we are at the policy, we've completed the policy framework, and we are just about starting the pathway framework, which is shown in the hexagonal shape. So what is next step for the pathways? The pathways the first step is to bring you the pathway framework, and then the staff will be working on creating a pathway or a couple of pathways that we can test and get some educational exercise done so that we will have better information as to what should our final blueprint plan look like. It involves both the pathway, which is the land use, and the call for transportation projects, which will both be included to develop the pathway scenarios. Now let's get into what are pathways. In order to understand how the land use and transportation decisions we make today will affect the future, and to identify strategies that can remain durable across a range of futures, in spite of changing and disruptive uncertainty, we are undertaking a scenario planning exercise known as a pathways. This is an academic learning exercise to learn comparative difference between widely different sets of futures, focusing on how land use and transportation investments interact to contribute to the triple bottom line goals. Again, we know that even though the focus is on land use and transportation, there are many other variables that will affect the outcome, such as work from home, the emerging technologies, pricing, etc. So what we are proposing to do is to have a sensitivity testing on all the variables to learn how they impact the outcomes. Staff is proposing to test 3 different pathways. Again, I want to emphasize that this is a learning exercise, and the pathways will utilize the population, housing, and employment growth projection the SACOG board adopted in February as part of the policy framework. Each of the pathways will explore a different theme. So what's pathway 1? The theme of pathway 1 is outward expansion. This will expand on historical trends with significant growth in developing communities. This pathway will have the least amount of infill and redevelopment, small lots, and attached housing. This is not extrapolating the history, but it is accelerating the recent outward expansion trends. This will provide the most rural residential and large lot single family housing. The focus will be on new highway capacity projects to meet mobility needs. This pathway has the highest number of new roads and capacity projects. The transit service will focus on geographic coverage rather than frequency of service. And the bicycle and pet facilities, the focus will be on connecting developing communities to existing network. Pathway 2. This pathway is a compact growth and phased expansion. This pathway comes in between pathway 1 and pathway 3 in terms of land use. This is also our adopted 2020 MTP SES, but updated to current conditions. So what are those current conditions? The current condition is that the 2020 MTP SES, the base year was 2016, and our current base year is 2020. So everything will be updated to reflect what's on ground in 2020. It will have an updated growth projections that the board approved and to reflect today's market conditions. The transportation projects will update and maintain mostly the projects from the 2020 MTP SES, and the updates will be based on completed or modified projects that have since happened. New transportation investments will be included where the growth patterns has shifted, and the transit will focus more on the increased service hours. The third and final theme is inward expansion. This is the direct other opposite spectrum of the first pathway, which is outward expansion. Vast majority of future growth will occur in infill areas. Most new small lots and attached housing will be in this pathway. The focus will be on the infill areas such as the centers and corridors and established community. This pathway is intended to explore the performance implication of a future that departs from today's land use trends. For transportation, the capacity projects will be used to address bottlenecks and congestion, and the focus will be on transit services to increase the frequency, and there will be a focus to connect the existing communities with a bike and trail network. I also want to mention that all these 3 pathways that I just mentioned, I'm mentioning only the technical information pertaining to this. But there are other components that are happening, like the engagement, the policy discussion, gathering input from stakeholders, etc. I just wanted to showcase or put some emphasis on the technical aspect of the work that the staff will be doing over the next couple of months. So the other part of developing the pathways is a call for transportation project. For the first time, SACOG staff will ask cities, counties, Caltrans, transit agencies, and other partner agencies to use a map interface instead of a spreadsheet to provide us with a project list that will go into the pathway development. To provide more detail about this approach and to orient agencies to the map interface, there will be a special regional planning partnership meeting later this month. So what's next? Over the next couple of months, SACOG will develop and test these pathways. We will use this as a learning tool for discovery. We will provide the board with an array of performance metrics and indicators that will help facilitate a discussion on what strategies are a priority for the board. Using this learnings and discussion, we will develop a preferred pathway in early 2023 that will become part of the final plan. And just to reiterate, the final plan will include the land use strategies, the transportation investment list and priorities, financial plan, and supporting policies and implementation strategies. With that, I would like to open for questions.
Thank you. I expect that there will be some. So first of all, this is for information today, and so we're not taking an action. So we're not going to be making a motion. We're just going to be making sure we all understand, and if we have some requests or guidelines that we'd like to have you consider, we can bring those up. I'm sure there are questions. Are there? Who would like to lead? Okay, I'll ask the first question until someone else comes forward. So this map interface sounds very intriguing. Can you describe it a little bit more? How would it work?
Yes. So today I have with me two leads for this work. One is Sam Shelton, who is leading the transportation development for the plan, and Dov Caden, who is the land use lead staff. So I would love to have Sam answer this question because he's living and breathing it for the last few months.
Sam, are you there?
I don't see Sam on the line, but Dov is here if you'd like him to try to answer anything.
Oh, I'm sorry. So let me see if I can answer that. The map interface is mostly an interactive way or a way for the partner agencies to give a description and also say the limits of from where to where this is happening. So usually one of the issues that we have when we get a project list in a spreadsheet, first of all, there's about 2,000, 3,000 projects that we get. And one of the problems that we face here when we are trying to model it is to know the extent of the project, where exactly it falls, because the description can vary between agencies. So we want to have a way of knowing what it means. Like we are not depending on the words to describe a project, but we are actually looking at the project. This will help us not only to find the exact location, but the extent, the year of completion, and anything else that goes into it that is important for us to know as we are looking at all these transportation projects.
Very good. And I see Director Schneer has a question, but also Mr. Shelton has his hand up as well. So perhaps he'd like to weigh in. Are you there, Sam?
Yeah, thank you, Don, appreciate it. So just a couple of comments. One is appreciate the work. I know it's a lead into a tremendous amount of work. And so getting this right at the beginning will make all of your jobs and our jobs easier as we go forward. I'm assuming that the three pathways are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Is that fair to say?
Dov, would you like to answer that question?
Are we locked into those, what's included in each?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that, Manu. Yeah, no, you're certainly not locked into anything here. This is really sort of the first preliminary exercise to try to understand, what are the performance impacts of the different variables that, we look at on the land use and transportation side. So we'll have a whole process after this pathways and looking at the performance where we kind of narrow in on a single pathway that may look to combine certain aspects of these three pathways. But this certainly should not be looked at as sort of like a menu where you're going to have to select, one of these and one of these only.
No, that's great. I mean, my assumption here is, and I would greatly look forward to the metrics that you develop, we have some pretty lofty targets that we're going to have to get to, and how understanding how each of these pathways and the sub pieces of each of the pathways, as you described them, move us towards that goal. So I always want to start with where do we want to end up with, and then choose the strategies that help us get there as quickly as possible or painlessly as possible.
Thank you, Jay. I think a lot of the consideration of the scenario planning as an approach to this challenge of planning for the future is similar to what we did with the blueprint in 2000. Well, I guess it was 2005 when that was conducted. And the pathways or scenarios really drive us to consider what happens under certain circumstances. So you're imagining it's a way to open the door to how this stuff fits together and how it in the end where we'll be, and Jay's kind of thinking. So the pathway themselves, that's none of them will probably be the defined answer, but they help us to think things through.
Here, Sailor, do you mind if I try to add in here?
Sure.
And I hope I got this right, and I hope my staff will jump in and do a friendly amendment if I don't. For all kinds of reasons, I mean, it was a good reference back, I think, to the blueprint 20, the original sort of smart growth land use blueprint 20 years ago. For all kinds of reasons, in the past, when we've done long range plans, we've kind of had this very narrow band of differentiation in some ways. And I think some of you have asked about this in previous cycles. How can you be so sure the future is going to look like that? And if we did any kind of alternatives, they were really, minuscule, right? They were very small differentiation. And with this approach that Banu just walked you through, we're really trying to figure out how can we ask some of the bigger questions that, frankly, we've been a little constrained for all kinds of reasons in the past, largely through kind of state law. What are the consequences of short-term actions, decisions, things in your control, things not in your control for the future? And you're going to hear this theme through the pathways and the development of the blueprint, the long-range plan. You're going to get a bit of an exercise on this at the board retreat on April the 8th. In the April board meeting, we've asked Envision Utah and the head of Envision Utah to come and talk to the board in your workshop, because they were really, in some ways, the pioneers of looking at the future and asking the big questions, connecting today's decisions to tomorrow's outcomes. And then again, we're trying to develop at the request of Chair Jennings, actually a trip to Salt Lake City in June to actually go look on the ground. So because this is such an important, I think, moment and year for us to ask these big picture questions and to understand scenario planning, right? And there are no right answers. This is an exercise that I get the feeling that many of you are actually a little hungry for, because you're asking a lot of questions about what we might do now to ensure that we have a better future tomorrow. And so we're endeavoring to do that and lift a little bit of those constraints, if you will, or narrowness of the focus that we've had in the past, and really try to tease out what will begin to make a difference and an impact. And I know there will be all kinds of, your brains will get going, as they should, with questions around the unpredictability of the future. But our job is to try to give you some sense of what are the variables, right? What's kind of in our control, what's not in our control, and how might that add up? How might all of your decisions across all 28 jurisdictions, right, add up to larger impacts and outcomes, both positive and negative?
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, James. There's not an action for us. Are there any other comments before we move to the next item? Appreciate the framework that you laid out for us to stay tuned for coming attractions, right? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move to item 12, which is an update on engage, empower, and implement. That's Ms. Ramos is here with us.
Yes. Thank you. Good morning. Let me just share my screen. Okay, confirming that it's being displayed properly. Okay,
Yes.
sounds good. Okay, well, good morning, everyone. My name is Rosie Ramos Gomez. I'm the project manager for Engage, Empower, Implement, or EEI for short. Sorry to add another acronym to your list. As a reminder, in 2020, as part of the board's action on the funding commitments for the last funding round, the board established a pot of seed money for a disadvantaged communities pipeline program. And this is that program we've just rebranded. And so this committee and the board has heard a little bit about EEI through the presentation on from some of my colleagues on the next funding rounds, but today I'm here to give a little more context and information and an overview for what our plans are for this program and what you can expect from us in the months to come. So as I mentioned already, the board had made this commitment of $3 million in late 2020 to invest in the region's most underserved and systemically oppressed communities. And aligning with our newly adopted racial equity statement, this program is planned to specifically work with the Black, Indigenous, Asian, Pacific Islander, Hispanic, and Latinx, and other communities of color, as well as our low-income communities in general. And so what is EEI? EEI is seed funding, that $3 million that will be used to create a pipeline of equitable, safe, and sustainable projects throughout the Sacramento region that are community-led, starting from the identification of issues and needs to solution ideation, and finally project design. So starting with Engage, we plan to create a program that enables our awardees to engage with their communities before any project is defined, to learn what their priorities are and challenges that they face. And this program aims to do the engagement first and fund our cities and counties' efforts to plan with their communities and not just for them. And I would like to note that typically when we think about engagement, it's often done in later parts of a project's phase, but with this program, we really want to start with engagement. After engaging with them and understanding their needs, we want to enable communities to create their own projects and to share power when it comes to project design. So these projects meet the needs of the community and it's what they want. In other words, we're sharing the design process with community by bringing in the expertise from planners, but having the guidance and direction from community. And with the seed funding for our cities and counties, along with community partners to do the engagement and understand the needs of the community and empowering them to co-design projects. In a process that shares power, we are then able to create a pipeline of projects that are rooted in community with equity at their core. And these projects would then be ready to receive implementation funding either from SACOG funding sources, state or federal government programs or beyond. So we are still in the initial stages of developing this program, but what we need to do is essentially create a framework that outlines the goals, the guidelines, the process, the evaluation metrics, as well as developing the resources and tools and the other materials that our cities and counties and community partners will need to do this type of work. And to create all of this, we need to listen and learn to lots of folks, including our community-based organizations, our partners and stakeholders, but of course, and most importantly, our own members, our cities and counties that we serve. And so this framework components will directly inform the resulting EEI funding application requirements. And one important piece for EEI will be to bring on consultants to help us because we do not have all of the answers. And we will bring on a consultant for technical expertise regarding equity, but most importantly, we'll also bring on a CBO partner that will lead the CBO engagement efforts. This partner will help us strategize the outreach efforts to CBOs from across the region that will have a large hand in developing the framework and the tools and resources needed to make EEI a success. And additionally, we'll work directly, like I mentioned earlier, with our cities and counties to ensure that they're able to implement this program and provide them the tools and resources they need to do so. And I want to note that there are a lot of pieces that are still to be defined because we are trying to make this a collaborative effort with our community, with our member organizations. And so this, so that the framework is truly equitable and representative of the cities and counties as well. And so here is a visual representation of the various components I went over with SACOG working with the lead CBO partner and potentially a working group that can bring in community perspectives, engaging with the board and their cities and counties, as well as bringing on other partners and stakeholders as appropriate. And here is our timeline. So beginning now and through the spring, we'll be doing the process of procurement to bring on our consultant and our partner, creating the working group to help us with the CBOs. And in the summer, we'll work on the framework piece of it and the resources and materials, the guidelines. And then we would plan to take a framework to the board at the end of the year or late fall of 22 for your action, and would release a call for applications in early 2023. And I would also like to note that we did take this to REI working group last week, and they made some helpful remarks. 3 key themes throughout the presentation or through the discussion was identifying the types of CBOs that we will look for and share that with them so they can help us recruit, but to also understand that CBOs are very much at capacity, and so be very aware of that as we try to engage them. That we should very much leverage the relationships that we're building with CBOs through this program for long-term relationships and institutionalizing this style of engagement for SACOG, and to really think about the current gaps with the implementation funding. And I also heard from our peer agency, MTC. They were guests to talk about community-based transportation efforts that they have out in the Bay Area that they've done for the last 20 years or so. And this was actually a precursor for the full workshop that we will be hosting at the board meeting, welcoming back MTC as well as San Joaquin COG. And so that just about wraps up my presentation, but you will see me again at the March work workshop to share this information to the full board. And we're also bringing in some guests, like I mentioned, MTC, but also SJCOG, and they'll talk about some very similar efforts that they're working on in their communities. So that concludes my presentation. Happy to have any questions. For the members that were already at the REI working group, please feel free to add anything.
Thank you very much, Rosie. Are there questions or comments from members of the committee? I think this positions us very well. It builds on the work that we've been doing together with the REI group, and it positions us well for competition for federal and state funding streams, and allows our local jurisdictions to have access as we move forward. We'll have access to some funding to help seed some of this activity. So very, very good presentation. Are there any? I don't see any hands from the committee members. Are there any public comments? Okay, it's not for action today, and we can move on. Thank you very much, Rosie, for your presentation.
Thank you.
And that brings us to item 13, the Regional Active Transportation Policy Framework, and Victoria Cacciatore is here with us this morning.
I am, and thank you for the introduction. I am Victoria Cacciatore, of Transportation Analyst here at SACOG, and I lead up the Regional Active Transportation Policy Framework. Confirm, can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Fantastic. So let's do a quick walkthrough on this. Active Transportation Program is a funding source that is used to increase biking and walking in California. The Regional Active Transportation Program, or if you'll forgive me the use of the acronym ATP, is a 6-county program that SACOG jointly implements with El Dorado County Transportation Commission and Placer County Transportation Planning Agency. So today I'm asking for your input on the draft framework that you see in attachment A, and then this will be returning to you next month with a request to recommend it for approval to the board. So what we're going to expect with this round, this is our highest ATP funding estimate to date. This is due to the influx of federal funding. We have about a 35% increase above our normal year-to-year funding amounts. Statewide, they have about $298 million to distribute through a competitive program. Regionally, we're expected to have about $15.9 million for this program. Caltrans budgets is still refining the numbers, and we may have a slight adjustment upward later in this month, but we'll come back with you more information on that in April. So I think This funding program is very unique in a couple of different respects, but the process that projects compete in is definitely the most unique. First, projects have the option to compete in a statewide competitive program. That's the one that I mentioned has $298 million to distribute across the state of California. The projects are evaluated using state criteria. They use a state application and forms, but then the kind of unconventional part is that unsuccessful projects that compete in the state then have an option to compete in the regional program for that $15.9 million that I mentioned. So our regional program includes anybody that was unsuccessful in getting state funding, but we use a regional process and regional scoring criteria, which is in attachment A. SACOG staff then also develops regional applications and forms working with El Dorado County Transportation Commission and with Placer County Transportation Planning Agency. And we do our absolute best to make sure that we're using as much information as possible as was already provided in the state application. I would note that while project sponsors, so the cities, counties, school districts, other lead implementers are encouraged to apply to the state process first and make use of these two different chances to compete for funding. They are not required to apply to the state in order to compete for regional funds. So what we are looking at today, we have by and large, we're proposing the same application process as we used last cycle. Sponsors are encouraged, but not required, to apply to the state first. We'll work with El Dorado and Placer to develop application materials and leverage the tools that use state applications whenever possible. And we are also looking to add in regional criteria like describing how a project contributes to a local economic vitality strategy, or identifying how it supports larger greenhouse gas reduction efforts. So some of the main changes, or I would say the three main changes that we're looking at, we want to propose resuming the 11.47% requirement of non-ATP investment. This directly ties to something that we did in the last cycle. We adopted our policy framework in early May 2020, and to say that there was economic uncertainty in May of 2020 is one of the biggest understatements that I can make. There was a lot of apprehension. We didn't know how long the pandemic was going to go on or if it was going to be a short blip. And a lot of the local revenues that are frequently used for non-ATP match or leverage were greatly called into question. So we used a one-time reduction of the non-ATP requirement to 7% to assuage some of those concerns, with the understanding that we would look to resume the 11.47% requirement the next cycle. The next bucket of policy framework proposals are a new component of implementing regional plans. So I noted that we are having complementing Green Means Go implementation in here. We mentioned Green Means Go in our prior policy framework, but the project, or it was really still more of a concept at that time. We are further along in the Green Means Go program now. We have some funding identified to address those non-transportation challenges that come along from incentivizing and supporting infill. Recognize that keeping Green Means Go in the policy framework as it was last time is a really great opportunity to complement that one-time funding that we have through Green Means Go. There'll be more on Green Means Go at other points in time, but I just wanted to recognize how these two could work together to further the regional goals. The newer part is an introduction of how active transportation program could help implement the regional trail network. This is a new proposal for this round, identifying up to 5 points for regional trail plan implementation. And it is a follow-up from last cycle when the board expressed interest in using ATP funds to support the regional effort. At that time, we noted that it was a little, that we didn't have enough of the planning work under our belts yet to tie specific funding sources to it, but now we are much further along. We will be presenting a network for adoption next month as part of advancing the plan and wrapping up this first leg of the regional trail planning effort by June. And we think that there would be a really great opportunity to revisit that interest from the board and see if there's still the appetite for using active transportation program funds to implement regional trail network connections. As one other note to that part, we analyzed the past regional ATP investments and found that across all of the cycles that we've done, only 14% of our active transportation focused funding has been directed toward trails. And the last bit that I'll be diving into a bit more in the next couple of slides is increasing the investment minimums and goals for the disadvantaged communities. So I want to identify that there are several different definitions used for identifying disadvantaged communities, both from the state active transportation program that looks at median household income, environmental exposures by using Kalenviro screen tools, access to free or reduced lunch programs, and looking at social determinants of health through the Healthy Places Index tool. And then lastly, tribal lands. That's all in addition to our region-specific metrics that you can see in attachment B, where we identify the geographies that are analyzed as part of the environmental justice analysis from our long-range transportation plan. So across the 5.5, depending on how you want to count the Senate Bill 1 augmentation back in 2017, 2018, we have invested about 2/3 of all of the available funding in projects that benefit disadvantaged community residents. This is well in excess of the statewide requirement that 25% of the available funds go to projects that are going to benefit disadvantaged community residents. It's also well in excess of our proposed regional target of having a 40% investment minimum in projects benefiting disadvantaged community residents. And across all of the funding all of the past rounds, we would still exceed the 60% aspirational goal. But as you can see, we haven't met that in all of the past cycles. So it really would be an aspiration. So with these new targets, how would that impact the scoring process? The SACOG process of scoring ATP projects is unique in the state. We have a different way of where we use the question where we evaluate the benefits to disadvantaged community residents as more of a reporting metric, as opposed to factoring it into the score that is used to rank all projects for funding. And so how this would play out is that right now, if we do not have a funding package that invests a minimum of the available funds, 25%, in projects that would benefit disadvantaged community residents, then we add in those points for disadvantaged community benefit and then re-rank all of the projects. With this proposal, we would have a higher threshold for determining when we would need to add in those disadvantaged community benefit points. The threshold would be this 40% line instead of the 25% line that's required through the state. I'd also like to note that when you're looking at the percentage of residents that are living in the disadvantaged communities, as identified through the long-range transportation plan environmental justice analysis, 37.5% of the residents currently live in these communities. And that's not even accounting for how across the entire plan, we see that residents of the environmental justice communities very frequently walk and bike more often and at higher rates than people outside of those communities. So one quick pause, I realized I had my slides out of order. I wanted to recap that we'll be bringing this back for your action next month, a request for you to recommend it to the board for approval at their April meeting. And that I mentioned those, the statewide process, the statewide competition has an important milestone coming up. They will be releasing the call for projects on March 16th. And state ATP applications will be due June 15th. But with those two dates in mind, I would like to request the committee's input on the draft policy framework that you see in attachment A.
Very good. I really appreciate the presentation and the outline of things to come. So we've got some really interesting opportunities here. Are there questions or comments on the framework that's been presented to us? I'm not seeing hands from folks. I think that we're.
I'll go ahead. Just a question for Victoria. I don't know if she can answer this. So ATP funds a certain set of projects. We can measure, I think, the impact of those projects, or at least where they are on an overall scale. If the goal was to get everyone to an equal place, different than equity on this, but using an equity as a model to bring everyone up to the same level, would that require 100% of our ATP funds going to underserved communities, 90%, 80%? Do we have any idea? Because I know the 40%, which is great, and I would be supportive of an aspirational goal beyond that. But how does that actually fit into the context of reality of where we are and where we want to get to? Does that make sense?
I think it does, but I think that I don't have an answer for exactly how much of a regional funding gap there is and what it would take to ensure even just that minimum, like you were saying, that the equal access, not even so much accounting for equitable access. I don't have an answer for how much funding would be needed both in this round and future rounds to account for the infrastructure gaps that we have.
Because I would assume that the 25%, the 40%, and the 60% are somewhat arbitrary numbers based on a need that I would hope we can all agree on. But what would it really take? And to me, that's kind of a fundamental question of where we want to go. Will we ever catch up at 40%? If we do 40%, will we ever catch up where everybody's at the same level? You know, it's kind of like the road paving stuff. We want to get everybody to 70% or whatever it is. So what will that take? James, do you?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the line of inquiry, Director Chenier, and I also appreciate some really good conversations that Victoria's facilitated with a lot of our partners, including El Dorado County Transportation Commission and PCTPA, because their question has been, how do we assign a benefit to these projects for residents of disadvantaged communities? It really isn't enough to say it's geographically inside a mapped area, right? And so I appreciate Victoria saying, you know what, we can't answer that question because that's what we should tell you when you ask hard questions or simple questions with not easy answers. But there's two things I would say. One is in the trails plan that Victoria is also working on that we're really excited about, we've got some really interesting metrics in there, and stay tuned for that because I think at least access to that regional trail network, I think we can start to measure who has access, who can use it, right? Who does it benefit? So stay tuned on that one. And then secondly, and this goes back to a little bit of our Charles Brown presentation. And I think in the coming months, and we provided a little bit of a look ahead for this committee, we're gonna be talking about safety. And there is a big dimension, right, for lower income communities and communities of color around fatalities and injuries, infrastructure, lack of investment. And so I think there too, we can begin to give you a little bit more data and analysis around disparities and those things and look at ways in which we can kind of close that gap. If that, I don't know if that's satisfying to you at all, but it's a great question. I don't think we have the full answer for yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a step along the way, right? You know, what's the goal here? Is it to get every community have a certain level of trails? If that is, what's that going to take? And then it's, I think, a little bit, it's probably still hard, but to make the decision about what percentage should go to those folks to close the gap versus everybody getting something. I mean, it's not a new question, right? It's just, I'm not as articulate as I should be about it.
No, I appreciate that. And I would connect this back to the racial equity statement the board adopted last month, right? The idea there is where there are disparities, where there's a lack of access in communities for a variety of reasons, we want to be able to have everybody truly access that. And that doesn't mean that everybody gets, every community gets $5 to invest in trails, right? It means we look at this as a network. We look at it as a whole, and where there disparities exist, we try to close those disparities in order to give everyone, right? Everybody, all ages, all abilities, all residents access to that network. And that is the piece around equity that I think we're going to continue to want to sharpen as we go forward. But I really appreciate that.
I guess the other way I would phrase it, James, is, if we want so let's, on the trails piece, right? We want everyone to have access by 2040, right? Whatever number that is, that's the goal. So then what does it take? And then figuring out what the percentage needs to be to get to that goal is a little different than kind of backing into it the way we're doing it. Which isn't a bad thing. I mean, I think it's pretty hard to do, but maybe that's a little bit clearer of what I'm trying to get at.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jay. I appreciate the comments. And I think the slide that Victoria presented that showed the different levels of investment in disadvantaged community areas, I think that was pretty interesting to me to see the actual levels exceeded this minimum target. And I expect that as this unfolds, that's likely to, it's at least as likely to occur again as not, that if we have a minimum threshold, but we have the projects that come forward are likely to exceed that. And I think it's really powerful to hear that El Dorado and Placer are both signed on to this minimum threshold. Is it possible to do a little bit of that kind of thinking that Jay has asked for, just to see where we are against some desired future? Maybe that's something you can consider, how you might have a.
Well, do we know the desired? Do we know the desired future?
No, we don't. No, we don't. That's the challenge.
I think the desired future is that anybody can get outside and walk or ride a bicycle and feel safe, right? That's a desired future. Am I wrong about that? You tell me.
Well, I would say, and add to that, and have access to trails that can get them where they need to go.
Yeah,
that's the logical extension. So measuring it is harder.
Measuring it is harder. But I again, I think we're taking notes here. we know that there's a desire for data analysis. It's not enough for us to say that their disparities exist and leave it at that. We know there's that desire. So this is a good challenge. I appreciate it.
Okay. Other comments from committee members?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Sander.
I would suggest there are probably low-hanging fruit projects here along the lines of what Jay was just talking about, where existing networks have gaps in them. Those are probably found along jurisdictional lines more than anywhere else. But closing those gaps could yield very big, access to mobility for underserved neighborhoods. So I would think, and that's one example. There are probably other examples of gaps. Bridges, maybe, might be the most likely gap because it's just slightly more expensive to do that than make a surface trail. Maybe that ought to be a particular focus, and we could prioritize based on how much network we could connect.
Good, interesting comment. Thank you, Mr. Sander. Other comments or questions? Okay. I think that even the conversation we're having to this point, I can see the wheels are turning in the brains of our colleagues as we look around the committee. So I think this has been a good conversation to start thinking about this very busy time that we got on ATP. Mr. Ledesma, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I couldn't get the raised hand icon fast enough. So good morning, everyone. So I love the conversation, and you're right, my wheels are turning, and I guess my question is how connected are we to the folks in individual agencies? And so, for instance, in our city or Don and at YCTD, where we both sit as board members. But I think at that staff level, we're probably seeing some of those gaps and could identify them much quicker. Right? So I'm just asking the question, or how are we connecting this kind of process of evaluating where the gaps are back to the folks that are actually trying to identify them and close them on our own with individual application grants? Is that sort of the mechanism you're thinking about?
Victoria, do you want to respond?
Yes, I can respond to that. What we normally do to try to communicate how projects can fill in gaps or how they fit into a larger network is largely, I would say, through both mapping tools that we put out, especially in support of active transportation program, and then also that is a large part of what we've been trying to do with the regional trail network connections is having focused conversations with staff at agencies and saying, we have Yolo County who is willing to consider this as a study corridor and increasing access. How does that meet up with West Sacramento's boundaries? And being able to identify the potential for these connections and really elevating the conversations around it. But as far as how it goes on a project level, when somebody is putting together an application for it, we normally try to make that information easily accessible and viewable through regional data sets and tools such as the project performance assessment, which has been used in past funding programs led by SACOG.
It looks like there's some really interesting connected tissue here between the Engage, Empower, Implement program outline and the outreach that sets out, the regional trails network and the plan that we'll see in April, and this ATP piece. Are just a lot of synchronicity kind of coming together.
Director Ledesma, I know Director Branscombe has his hand up, but let me just try to, I think what I heard you say is we have a lot of local knowledge in our agencies around the region, cities, counties, YCTD, and the like, and are we making sure that we're including that local knowledge? And I think that's what I hear you saying.
That's exactly right. And I think I had in mind a little bit what Chair Saylor was bringing up after the EEI kind of thought, right? Is how do we and empower that even knowledge, right? Because
right, yeah, and I think we appreciate that. I know, I hope you all appreciate the powerhouse that is Victoria Cacciatore and her connectivity around the region, and how many people say, "Oh my gosh, thanks for Victoria for," so. But that's not to say that we don't need to be reminded to make sure that we're not just thinking about this at a regional level, but we're using all of both your capacity and your agencies, right? Many of which you sit on the boards for, but also for communities, which again is the tie back to EEI, and sometimes we don't know what we don't know. So I appreciate that.
Yep.
Thank you, Chris. Mr. Director Branscombe.
Thank you, sir. I may be just demonstrating my firm grip on the obvious, but my experience in the technology business taught me that the value of any network is a direct function of the number of nodes on that network. So an equitable distribution of access points is clearly in the best interest of the value of the network. I'd like to hear more about the desired destinations. In other words, we have these access points, but do the access points take the users of the network to the desired destinations, destinations for commerce, entertainment, connectivity to other neighborhoods, et cetera. And maybe that's been covered and I missed it, but that thought came to mind. Thank you.
Victoria, do you want to take a little bit of that on, just on the trails study?
Oh, I could do it both on the trails and for the policy framework, because when you think about these together, that is one of the most important parts of what makes an infrastructure improvement valuable is, where does it connect you to? A network in and of itself is not valuable. People need to be able to use it to get somewhere that they want to go, somewhere that's important. And where you can find that in the ATP framework is under our largest scoring metric of how does the project increase biking and walking. It talks about how the project increases walking and bicycling by connecting people to destinations, and by strengthening the active transportation network with solutions designed for them. And that's one simple statement that has three important components of what makes it possible and attractive for a person to bike and walk somewhere. Within the discussion of how that fits into our trail network planning, I would say that we heard that also loud and clear from all of our technical advisors, so city and county staff and community serving organizations that have been extra invested in helping us work on trail network connectivity, which is that people only will use a trail and for transportation purposes if it's going to take them somewhere that they want to go. We can try to identify places that from a policy level that we might think are important to connect to, but on the whole, we heard a lot of interest when we looked back at the survey on where people wanted to go through trail networks. They wanted to go to these community destinations. They wanted to go places where they could grab a bite to eat with their friends. They wanted to go to the community park where they can watch fireworks at 4th of July. They wanted to go to these specific places, and therefore the trail network is only of value if it connects people to where they want to go. And those are just some of the high level destinations. We worked with local agency staff to even further refine those of if these are things that we've heard are important at a regional level, what does that look like at your local level? And then ask people to share their local insight with us about it, since we are a regional agency, we are not omniscient. But I hope that is helpful for discussing the value of the network and the nodes.
Thank you.
Very interesting lens, Director Branscombe. Thank you for sharing that. Appreciate it. Other comments or questions? Okay, I don't see others. Are there any members of the public who'd like to address us on this topic?
I don't see any public comment.
Very good.
Mr. Chair, if I could make this one last comment,
Yes, David.
those edge connections between jurisdictions, I think those probably really are the leading challenge for all of us. We can plan internally, but planning that connection to the neighbor is tough because we don't really know what they're doing over there.
Right.
I think that's the key role for SACOG in convening discussions about where connections could be the highest yield or are the most obviously missing.
All those trails that lead to the dead end, the barbed wire fence or the
Exactly.
cliff.
Yeah. I think that's, I mean, it's literally no man's land in a way. And someone has to bridge that gap. And if each of our agencies doesn't do it on their own and bureaucratically, naturally, that's not a priority for them.
Yeah.
We have to have some outside influence that helps with that. And the offering of money would help.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it. I think the last item on our agenda is a receive and file on the May is Bike Month campaign. I think there's not a presentation anticipated on that topic. And then are there any other matters, Mr. Corliss or Ms. Svensk?
Chair Saylor,
Yes.
we do have a member of the public with their hand raised who'd like to make a comment. Would it be okay to hear them at this time?
Yes, I will do that. And Mr. Boosie, is it? And can you limit to 3 minutes?
Absolutely. Kevin Busey, County of Sacramento. I would be on the last item, I would be curious to, as we see this coming forward the next committee cycle, what is the percentage of the population in the 6-county region located within a disadvantaged community? I think that would be a helpful metric to understand. That would be great. So that was my comment. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. And our team has heard that comment and we'll consider that as we go forward. Appreciate that comment. Other matters, I think we have none. So that means we'll adjourn and our next meeting will be held also scheduled to be remote April 7. And we'll see you all at the board meeting in the near future. Thanks, everybody. Good job, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're adjourned.
Great job.